Mania thing, nowadays it's nothing like that. I mean, I can walk down the street and somebody just say, "Oh, hi, John," and they usually say, "How's your immigration?" You know, if it's in New York, right?
John Lennon was never afraid to speak his mind. Whether in interviews, on stage, or through his lyrics, he was as famous for his blunt honesty as he was for his music. That honesty has fed decades of myths, especially the claim that Lennon hated certain bands. Social media clickbait loves to paint him as a bitter critic who dismissed his peers. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Lennon's interviews, particularly the raw and often combative Rolling Stone sessions with Jan Wenner in 1970 and 1971, were full of heat. He was angry about the Beatles' breakup, disillusioned with the music industry, and eager to distance himself from old labels. Out of that stew came some of his sharpest barbs. But dig deeper, and you'll find that many of his so-called insults were more about genres, trends, or moments of frustration than outright hatred. In this countdown, we'll revisit 6 acts Lennon challenged most publicly.
For this evening, the Bony Rolls.
From his old partner Paul McCartney to the Rolling Stones and even Bob Dylan. You'll hear his actual words, the context behind them, and how his views evolved. Was it hate? Or just Lennon being Lennon? Let's count them down. Number 6. Paul McCartney, friends turned rivals.
Right. That was the way I got into it. He used to be in a jazz band.
Right.
He used to play piano and trumpet till his teeth gave out.
Of all John Lennon's supposed feuds, none has been exaggerated more than his clash with Paul McCartney. For years, the story has been told as if Lennon and McCartney ended their partnership in hatred. In truth, their relationship was far more complicated. Equal parts creative rivalry, personal hurt, and lingering affection. The bitterness peaked in the early 1970s, just after the Beatles' breakup. Paul's 1971 album Ram contained the song Too Many People, which Lennon quickly recognized as filled with veiled digs aimed at him and Yoko. Paul later admitted it had a few jibes directed at Lennon's new lifestyle. Lennon didn't let it slide. His response came in the form of one of the most infamous diss tracks in rock history, How Do You Sleep? On that song, Lennon poured out his resentment. The lyrics cut deep. The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day. He mocked Paul's most famous Beatles ballad and sneered at his solo debut single. The track left little doubt that Lennon felt betrayed and was lashing out. To fans and critics, it sounded like the definitive break between two of music's greatest collaborators. But even at the height of their feud, things weren't as simple as hate. Lennon later admitted the song was written in anger and didn't reflect his whole truth. He told interviewers it was a bit of a slagging match.
You can tell what people expect to be told. You know, when they've sort of read it in a book somewhere, what the answer is, and they just want to get it down on tape.
Born out of wounded pride rather than deep hostility. Paul, for his part, acknowledged the hurt, but said he understood it was Lennon's way of venting. Behind the public barbs, both men knew their creative partnership had been something special, and that knowledge never truly left them. What gets lost in the myth is that Lennon and McCartney never stopped caring about each other. After the public fireworks of the early 70s, the two gradually reconnected. By the late decade, Lennon was living in New York, and Paul would sometimes drop by for visits. Friends recall them laughing together, playing music informally, and sharing stories like old mates. The venom of How Do You Sleep gave way to a quieter affection that was rarely captured by the press. Lennon also continued to praise Paul's talents, even when he criticized his style. In later interviews, he described Paul as one of the most naturally gifted melody writers in history. He may not have always liked Paul's choices, but he never doubted his brilliance. The competitive tension that once drove them apart had also been the spark that made the Beatles extraordinary. So, was John Lennon's attack on Paul McCartney evidence of hatred? Not exactly. It was the raw outburst of an artist who felt betrayed, magnified by the media into a permanent feud. In reality, their relationship was cyclical. Rivals one moment, allies the next, and always bound by the bond of having changed the world together. Number 5. Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Jazz Rock Bullshit. If you wanted a blunt opinion in the early 1970s, you didn't have to look further than John Lennon. Fresh off the breakup of the Beatles, he was in no mood for musical trends he thought watered down rock's raw spirit. That's why, when Rolling Stone asked him in 1971 about the bands he was listening to, Lennon didn't hold back. His target, jazz rock giants Blood, Sweat, and Tears. "I don't like the blood, sweat, and tears so," Lennon told Jan Wenner. "I think all that is bullshit. Rock and roll is going like jazz, as far as I can see, and the Bullsgodders are going off into that excellentness which I never believed in." It was classic Lennon, profane, confrontational, and unwilling to pretend. Why such disdain? For Lennon, rock was supposed to be direct, visceral, and emotional. The jazz rock movement, blending horns, technical arrangements, and virtuoso performances, felt to him like the opposite: too polished, too clever, and too academic. He feared rock was heading down the same road jazz had, turning into a genre for intellectual showboating rather than raw feeling. There may have been another reason Lennon's comments stung with extra venom: competition. In 1970, Blood, Sweat, and Tears' self-titled album won the Grammy for Album of the Year, beating the Beatles' Abbey Road. To Lennon, who was already bitter about critics dismissing the Beatles' artistry, seeing a band he considered pretentious triumph over their final masterpiece must have felt like an insult. It's important to remember, though, that Lennon wasn't unique in his skepticism. Many rock purists of the era felt the same way about jazz rock and progressive rock. They saw sprawling solos and horn-heavy jams as distractions from the emotional punch that had made early rock revolutionary. Lennon's comments, harsh as they were, reflected a larger debate about where rock was headed in the 1970s. And yet, Lennon's criticisms weren't entirely consistent. He could admire innovation when it resonated with him. He loved experimentation, after all, from the Beatles' Revolver to his own avant-garde work with Yoko Ono. His problem with Blood, Sweat, and Tears wasn't experimentation itself, but what he saw as self-indulgence. For him, adding layers of horns and jazz flourishes didn't make rock deeper. It made it lose its soul. So was Lennon right? Blood, Sweat, and Tears went on to enjoy success in the early 70s, but they never achieved the cultural impact of the Beatles. Their style of jazz rock faded from the mainstream as rock shifted toward other sounds, from heavy metal to punk. In hindsight, Lennon's critique can be seen as both personal and prophetic. Here's the question for you. Do you think Lennon's dismissal of jazz rock as bullshit was fair? Or do you believe bands like Blood, Sweat, and Tears were pushing music forward in their own way? For Lennon, the answer was simple. He wasn't interested in clever arrangements or Grammy-winning polish. He wanted music that hit like a punch, stripped of pretense. And if that meant calling out blood, sweat, and tears in the bluntest terms possible, he wasn't afraid to do it. Number 4. Joan Baez and Judy Collins. Fruity Folk.
I do experience a lot of pain, but it's always side by side. With joy, you know, they say don't kill all your demons because...
If John Lennon was known for one thing in interviews, it was his refusal to sugarcoat. He had no interest in playing diplomat, even when it came to artists widely respected in the music world. That's why, in his fiery 1971 Rolling Stone interview with Jan Wenner, Lennon made headlines when he dismissed two folk icons, Joan Baez and Judy Collins, with a single withering phrase. "I never liked the fruity Judy Collins and Joan Baez and all of that stuff," Lennon said flatly. For him, their brand of polished coffeehouse folk lacked the grit and urgency he felt music needed. The comment was sharp, even cruel, and it shocked many readers. After all, both Baez and Collins were admired not only for their voices, but also for their activism and artistry. So why did Lennon take such a hard stance? Part of the answer lies in his view of folk music. Lennon admired Bob Dylan's early work, the raw, political songs of the early 60s that inspired the Beatles themselves to experiment with deeper lyrics. He also loved traditional working-class folk songs, especially those from the north of England. What he couldn't stand was what he considered sanitized or overly refined versions of folk music. To him, Baez and Collins represented that safe, middle-class strain, pleasant, beautiful, but not revolutionary. It's also worth noting Lennon's state of mind at the time. The interview took place just as he was reinventing himself with songs like Working Class Hero, a raw anthem of frustration and identity.
It is such an honor to have been a part of his life and to share that music and to have, loved him and even liked him.
Wenner had compared that track to Dylan's folk style, which may have triggered Lennon's defensiveness. He wanted his song to be seen as authentic social commentary, not lumped together with what he saw as genteel protest singers. Of course, Lennon's words don't tell the whole story. While he mocked Baez and Collins, he never denied their talent. He simply didn't connect with their style. In fact, his dismissal of them says more about his personal taste and artistic philosophy than about their actual contributions to music.
For 50 or 55 years or something, and she sometimes wants me to sing the song of hers that goes, how long since I...
Lennon craved music that was confrontational, unpolished, and shocking. Qualities he didn't find in Baez's crystalline soprano or Collins's carefully crafted performances. Looking back, Lennon's comment has to be taken with a grain of salt. He often exaggerated in interviews, playing the role of the provocateur. What sounded like hatred was often more about making a point than delivering a measured critique. Still, his words stung, especially for fans of Baez and Collins who saw them as powerful voices for social change. Here's a question for you. Was Lennon right to dismiss polished folk as fruity? Or did he overlook the emotional power those singers brought to their audiences? For Lennon, the answer was simple. Folk should be raw and real, not dressed up for polite applause. Whether you agree with him or not, the remark shows once again that his critiques weren't about personal grudges. They were about his unshakable belief that music should challenge, not comfort. Number 3, Frank Zappa, Respect and Ridicule.
For taste.
Oh, come on. You must have been thrilled.
I was sick, so it's hard to be truly.
John Lennon had a complicated relationship with Frank Zappa. On the surface, they shared plenty in common. Both were musical iconoclasts, both dabbled in avant-garde experiments, and both relished poking at authority. But when it came to ego and style, Lennon couldn't resist mocking Zappa, even as he acknowledged his brilliance. In Lennon Remembers, he described Zappa with biting sarcasm. Zappa's there screaming, "Look at me, I'm a genius. What do I have to do to prove to you sons of bitches what I can do?" Bang, bullshit. Lennon's complaint wasn't that Zappa lacked talent. He admitted he admired him a bit. What Lennon hated was what he saw as Zappa's desperate need for validation. For Lennon, true artistry didn't need to beg for recognition. The two actually crossed paths musically in 1971 when Lennon and Yoko Ono appeared on stage with Zappa and the Mothers of Invention at the Fillmore East in New York. The performance was chaotic, blending improvisation, screaming vocals, and raw guitar jams. For a brief moment, it looked like two avant-garde worlds colliding in harmony. But the collaboration ended in acrimony. When the concert was released on Lennon's album Sometime in New York City, Zappa claimed he was not properly credited and resented the way Lennon repackaged the material. From Lennon's perspective, Zappa embodied both the best and worst of experimental music. He admired his refusal to play it safe, but ridiculed his intellectual posture.
That the American public would refuse to deal with a group called the Mothers, so I had to head.
Lennon himself was often accused of pretentiousness, especially in his work with Yoko Ono. So it's possible that his barbs at Zappa were partly projection. By mocking Zappa's need to be seen as a genius, Lennon was also drawing a line between himself, who preferred to let the work speak, even if loudly, and Zappa, whom he saw as too desperate to prove his status. And yet, beneath the insults, there was grudging respect. Lennon didn't lump Zappa in with the artists he dismissed outright. He recognized him as a kindred spirit, someone pushing boundaries even if he didn't always like the results. Their brief, fractured collaboration is proof of that tension. Two strong-willed innovators who admired each other enough to work together, but too proud to get along for long. This duality makes the Lennon-Zappa connection fascinating. Was it rivalry? Was it respect? Or was it simply two avant-garde egos crashing into each other? Here's the question for you. Do you think Lennon's mocking of Zappa was fair criticism of pretension? Or was it just one genius throwing stones at another? For Lennon, the answer lay somewhere in the middle. He could ridicule Zappa's mannerisms while still tipping his hat to his courage. In the end, their uneasy relationship captured what Lennon himself was all about, refusing to idolize anyone, even when he admired them. Number 2, Bob Dylan, From Idol to Critic.
I have wanted that for me, but my parents never went anywhere. My father probably thought the capital of the world was wherever he was at the time. It couldn't possibly be.
Few musicians influenced John Lennon as profoundly as Bob Dylan. In the early 1960s, Dylan's sharp, poetic songwriting opened new doors for Lennon and the Beatles. Lennon once recalled playing Dylan's Freewheelin' album over and over again, stunned by its raw honesty. Dylan's example pushed Lennon beyond simple love songs, inspiring him to tackle more personal and political themes. Without Dylan, songs like Help or Norwegian Wood might never have been written. But admiration didn't stop Lennon from sharpening his tongue when Dylan took a turn he couldn't stomach. In 1979, Dylan released Slow Train Coming, his first overtly Christian record. The single, Gotta Serve Somebody, became a hit and even won a Grammy. But Lennon was appalled. To him, Dylan's new religious zeal sounded more like preaching than poetry. His reaction was merciless. He wants to be a waiter for Christ. He went further, dismissing the track outright. The backing is mediocre, the singing's really pathetic, and the words were just embarrassing. Never one to keep his critiques to himself, Lennon even wrote a parody response titled, Serve Yourself. In it, he mocked Dylan's spiritual message with biting satire, urging listeners to trust themselves rather than serve any higher power. It was Lennon at his most irreverent, rejecting not just Dylan's music, but the worldview behind it. Why was Lennon so harsh? Part of it comes down to timing. Lennon himself had flirted with spirituality, but he remained deeply skeptical of organized religion. He saw Dylan's conversion as a retreat into dogma, the opposite of the fearless honesty he had once admired.
See, I got these special binoculars, right? And they allow me to see into your soul.
Really?
In Lennon's view, Dylan had traded authenticity for preaching, and Lennon wasn't afraid to call it out. Still, Lennon's critique needs context. By 1979, he was living in semi-retirement, raising his son Sean, and stepping back from the music industry. He was still the Lennon of the 1960s, sarcastic, skeptical, and allergic to anything that smelled like conformity. Dylan's Christian music simply struck him as a betrayal of the rebellious spirit they had once shared. Of course, not everyone agreed. Dylan's gospel period has since been reevaluated by critics, with many praising its passion and conviction. Some fans see it as one of his boldest artistic choices, whether or not they agree with the message. But Lennon, ever the contrarian, couldn't separate the music from the sermon. This raises an interesting point. Was Lennon's parody of Dylan a fair piece of artistic dialogue? Or was it unnecessarily cruel? For Lennon, it was all about honesty. He admired Dylan too much to give him a free pass. If anything, his harshness shows how high his expectations were. He didn't mock every mediocre record on the charts, but he saved his barbs for someone he once idolized. To Lennon, Dylan had set the standard, and falling short of it was unforgivable. Their relationship was never simple. Part admiration, part rivalry, and always tinged with Lennon's restless need to push back. In the end, his criticisms of Dylan weren't proof of hatred, but of the deep impact Dylan had on him, as an idol, a competitor, and a mirror. Number 1. The Rolling Stones. Rivalry and imitation.
I didn't go for it, middle or working or whatever. You're so...
If there was one band John Lennon could never resist taking a jab at, it was the Rolling Stones. On the surface, Lennon and Mick Jagger were friendly. They appeared together at events, praised each other in interviews, and even shared stages. But beneath the smiles was a deep sense of rivalry, one Lennon was never shy about airing. In his fiery 1970 Rolling Stone interview, Lennon let loose on the idea that...
You said you thought that might be funny. Did you find it so?
Kind of. Not really funny, no.
First line says...
the Stones were more rebellious or daring than the Beatles. He insisted that the Stones had spent their career copying the Beatles' moves. I would like to just list what we did and what the Stones did 2 months after on every Fing album. Every Fing thing we did, Mick does exactly the same. He imitates us. It was a harsh claim, but Lennon wasn't entirely making it up. The Beatles had released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967. 2 months later, the Stones responded with Their Satanic Majesty's Request, a psychedelic concept album that many saw as their answer to Pepper. Lennon, who was fiercely protective of the Beatles' innovations, bristled at any suggestion that the Stones were leading the charge. At the same time, Lennon admitted to respecting Jagger and his band. In the very same interview where he accused them of imitation, he also acknowledged their power. They're not in the same class music-wise or power-wise, never were. But I like their funky music, I always dug it. This duality defined Lennon's relationship with the Stones, equal parts criticism and admiration. The press, of course, loved stoking the rivalry.
I mean, when you play the ABC, Wigan holds 2,000 people, do 2 houses for...
Beatles versus Stones became one of rock's defining debates, with fans and journalists comparing everything from their fashion to their politics. Lennon fed into that narrative, sometimes playfully, sometimes bitterly. By calling the Stones imitators, he wasn't just defending the Beatles' legacy, he was also poking at one of the band's most marketable myths, that they were the true rebels while the Beatles were the polished pop stars. In later years, Lennon softened his tone. By the mid-1970s, he had a more balanced view, recognizing that much of the so-called rivalry had been exaggerated. He remained close with Jagger personally and continued to acknowledge the Stones' contributions to rock. His earlier remarks, while stinging, were really part of a larger conversation about competition in the 1960s. For Lennon, rivalry wasn't hatred. It was fuel. It pushed him to innovate, to keep the Beatles ahead of the curve, and to prove that they weren't just following trends, but setting them. So, was Lennon right? Did the Stones truly imitate the Beatles, or were the two bands simply influencing each other in a rapidly changing era? That's the real question. What Lennon saw as imitation might also be described as dialogue. Two great bands reacting to each other, borrowing ideas, and pushing each other to greater heights. Without that back and forth, would either group have scaled the peaks of the 1960s? For Lennon, though, one thing was clear. If you tried to out-Beatle the Beatles, he was going to call you out. And that's exactly what he did with Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones. When people talk about John Lennon, they often focus on his bluntness. He was never afraid to call things as he saw them, whether it was Paul McCartney's post-Beatles output, blood, sweat and tears jazz rock polish, or Bob Dylan's religious conversion. His sharp tongue created unforgettable quotes, but it also built myths. Myths that he hated entire bands. In truth, Lennon's criticisms were rarely about personal grudges. They were about his restless search for authenticity. What Lennon couldn't stand was pretense. He hated labels that boxed music in. He distrusted trends that felt manufactured. And he had little patience for artists he thought were more interested in image than substance. But those same traits made him one of rock's great innovators. He was always pushing for something new, raw, and honest, even if that meant upsetting peers, critics, or fans. It's also important to remember how often his views shifted. He might mock Frank Zappa's ego in one breath and praise his daring in another. He could dismiss the Rolling Stones as imitators, but still admit he enjoyed their music. Lennon wasn't consistent. He was human, emotional, and unfiltered. That's what made his words sting, but also what made them real. So the next time you see a headline claiming Lennon hated some band, look closer. More often than not, it wasn't hate at all. It was Lennon wrestling with the same questions we still ask today. What makes music authentic? When does influence become imitation? And how much do rivalries actually drive innovation? What do you think? Were Lennon's critiques spot-on observations, or just bursts of cynicism? Share your take in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of rock history.